Good evening. Tonight, I'd like to invite you somewhere rather unusual, not to a grand palace, not to a famous museum, and not to one of Europe's great capitals. Instead, I'd like to take you to a quiet stretch of countryside in Belgium. At first glance, there is almost nothing remarkable about it. A few gentle hills, fields of wheat swaying softly in the breeze, birdsong drifting across the morning air, narrow country roads winding between old farms. If you were standing here today, you would probably think it was simply another peaceful corner of Europe. And that is exactly what makes this place so extraordinary. Because beneath these quiet fields, beneath the grass, beneath more than 200 years of silence, lies one of history's greatest mysteries. It was here, on this very ground, that an empire came to an end. Not in a single dramatic moment, not because of one catastrophic mistake, and perhaps not for the reason most people have always believed. History has a habit of simplifying the past. One great battle, one great hero, one great defeat. But real history is rarely that simple. It is built from countless small decisions, tiny moments, missed opportunities, unexpected delays, and choices that seemed ordinary at the time. Tonight, we are not here simply to tell the story of the Battle of Waterloo. We are here to investigate it. Think of this place as an old crime scene. The victim was an empire. The witnesses left behind letters, diaries, maps, official reports, and fading memories. The suspects are many: a violent storm, a delayed message, an exhausted emperor, a patient enemy, and a chain of seemingly ordinary decisions that quietly changed the course of European history. Over the next few hours, we will examine every clue, we will question every suspect, we will return to the battlefield, not as tourists, but as detectives. And perhaps, by the time our journey comes to an end, you will see Waterloo in a way you never have before. You may even discover that the answer has been waiting here all along. So, take one slow breath, settle into your chair, and together, let us open the first file. Case file number 1. Who really defeated Napoleon? Every investigation begins in the same place, at the scene itself. Long before questions are asked, long before suspects are named, a careful investigator simply stands still and observes. That is exactly what I would like us to do now. For just a little while, forget Napoleon, forget Wellington, forget the armies, forget everything you think you already know about Waterloo. Instead, simply look around. Imagine standing here just after sunrise. The air feels cool against your skin. The ground is still damp from yesterday's rain. The breeze carries the quiet scent of wet earth and summer grass. Nothing feels unusual, nothing feels important. Nothing suggests that this peaceful landscape once decided the future of an entire continent. If someone had brought you here without telling you where you were, you might never have guessed. Perhaps you would admire the rolling hills. Perhaps you would stop for a moment to listen to the birds. Perhaps you would notice the wheat moving gently beneath the morning wind, and perhaps you would simply keep walking. That is history's greatest illusion. Time has an extraordinary gift. It softens even the deepest scars. The grass grows again. The trees grow taller, rain washes away the blood, wind carries away the smoke, and little by little the earth hides the memories of violence beneath remarkable beauty. But hidden does not mean forgotten, because every battlefield remembers, not with words, not with monuments, but with silence, a silence so complete that it almost dares us to believe nothing ever happened here. If we could step backward through time, not by years, but by moments, the silence would disappear. The birds would fall quiet. The wind would carry different sounds, the creaking of wagon wheels, the restless movement of horses, the metallic click of muskets being checked one final time, the quiet voices of men who had no idea that history was about to remember them forever. Some of those men were only 18 years old. Some had spent more than a decade following Napoleon across Europe. Some believed today's battle would be their final victory. Others quietly feared it might become their last sunrise. None of them knew, none of them could know, that 200 years later millions of people would still speak about this field, that historians would continue arguing over every decision, every mistake, every delayed order, every unexpected moment. Because for them, this was not history, it was simply tomorrow's work arriving a little earlier than expected. But if the field is our crime scene, then we must ask a simple question: what evidence did it leave behind? Not all evidence looks dramatic. Sometimes it is not a sword, or a cannon, or a fallen flag. Sometimes the first coup is something quieter: a road, a slope, a farmhouse, a patch of ground that became important only because thousands of men were forced to move across it. Waterloo was not a flat, empty plain. That detail matters. The land rose and fell gently. Ridges crossed the fields. Roads cut through the countryside. Farmhouses stood like small islands among the crops. To a traveller, these details might seem unimportant. To a general, they could decide everything. A ridge could hide an army. A muddy road could delay artillery. A farmhouse could become a fortress. A small orchard could consume hundreds of lives. And a field that looked peaceful in the morning could become a maze by afternoon. When Wellington chose his position, he was not choosing beauty. He was choosing protection. His army stood along a ridge south of Brussels. But much of it was not visible from the French side. Many soldiers waited behind the slope, hidden from Napoleon's guns, hidden from his eyes. That single detail would become one of the most important clues in the entire case, because sometimes the most dangerous army is the one you cannot fully see. Napoleon looked toward that ridge and saw an enemy he believed he could break. But he did not see everything. No commander ever does. That is one of the quiet truths of battle. From far away, war looks organized. Lines on a map, arrows of movement, carefully written orders. But on the ground, it is confusion, smoke, mud, noise, fear, and decisions made with only half the information needed. If we want to understand Waterloo, we must resist the temptation to judge too quickly. It is easy to stand 2 centuries later with maps, books, and perfect hindsight and say what should have been done. It is much harder to stand in the mud under a grey Belgian sky, with messengers arriving late, with smoke hiding the enemy, with horses exhausted, with soldiers waiting for orders, and make a decision that might change the future of Europe. That is why this investigation must move slowly. We are not searching for a single villain, not yet. We are learning how the scene itself shaped the crime. And already the battlefield has given us 3 clues. The first, the ground was not simple. The second, much of Wellington's army was hidden. The third, the night before the battle, the weather had changed everything. Because before the first cannon fired, before the first charge began, before Napoleon made his final gamble, something had already happened. Something ordinary, something almost too simple to suspect. Rain had fallen over Belgium, and by morning, the entire case had changed. Rain. It sounds almost too ordinary, too small, too harmless. When people imagine the Battle of Waterloo, they usually picture cavalry charges, roaring cannons, lines of infantry disappearing beneath clouds of smoke. Very few imagine rain. Yet every investigation begins by questioning the obvious, and in this case the obvious has been quietly waiting for us since the evening before the battle. During the afternoon of the 17th of June, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered above the Belgian countryside. By evening, heavy rain swept across the fields of Waterloo. Not for a few minutes, for hours. The roads became rivers of mud. The fields softened beneath thousands of boots and horses. Every wagon grew heavier. Every wheel sank deeper into the earth. By dawn, nothing looked unusual from a distance. The hills were still there. The farms still stood. The trees still swayed in the morning breeze. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. For Napoleon, time had always been one of his greatest weapons. He preferred to move quickly, to strike before his enemies could fully prepare, to force events to unfold according to his own rhythm. Speed had carried him across Europe. Speed had built an empire. But speed depends on movement, and movement depends on the ground beneath your feet. Heavy artillery was the pride of the French army. Some of Napoleon's guns weighed well over a ton. On dry ground, teams of horses could move them with remarkable efficiency. On soaked ground, everything slowed. The wheels no longer rolled, they dragged. Each hill demanded more effort, each field required more time. Every delay spread quietly through the army like ripples across still water. For generations, many people accepted a simple explanation. Napoleon lost because of the rain. It is an attractive answer, simple, easy to remember, easy to repeat. But history is rarely so generous. Simple answers often hide more complicated truths. Rain delayed the battle. That much is certain. The ground was wet. That is beyond dispute. The artillery was less effective during the opening hours. That is also true. But none of those facts answer our central question. Could rain alone defeat Napoleon Bonaparte? Or was it merely the first piece of a much larger puzzle? There is another detail, one that is often overlooked. While the French were waiting, the Allied army was also waiting. But for Wellington, time was an ally. Every passing hour strengthened his position. Every passing hour allowed his soldiers to rest. Every passing hour increased the possibility that help would arrive. Somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, the Prussian army was still marching. Its soldiers were exhausted, its uniforms were soaked, its boots were heavy with mud. Yet they continued forward, one step after another. Every minute lost by Napoleon was another minute gained by Blücher. The rain was no longer simply weather, it had become time. And time was beginning to change the balance of the battle. Perhaps rain was never the true culprit. Perhaps it was simply the first witness, the first clue, the first quiet reminder that history is often shaped by ordinary things. A storm, a muddy road, a delayed march, a few lost hours. By themselves, none of them seemed powerful enough to destroy an empire. Together, they would begin to tell a very different story. And somewhere beyond the clouds, morning was breaking over Waterloo. The waiting was almost over. Soon, the first decisions would be made, and once they were made, there would be no turning back. Morning arrived quietly, without ceremony, without triumph, without certainty. The rain had passed. The clouds were beginning to break apart. Thin rays of sunlight slowly spread across the Belgian countryside. For a brief moment, the battlefield looked almost peaceful again. If you had arrived there at dawn, you might have believed that nothing extraordinary was about to happen. You would have seen soldiers preparing breakfast over small fires, officers studying damp maps, horses grazing where they could, wagons standing motionless in the mud. It looked surprisingly ordinary. That is one of history's greatest paradoxes. The mornings that change the world usually begin like every other morning. No music announces them, no voice whispers that history is about to turn a page. Life simply continues until one decision changes everything. For the men waiting on both sides of the valley, this was another day of uncertainty. Many had fought together for years, others had survived battles that once seemed impossible. Some believed they would survive this one as well. A few carried a quiet feeling they could never quite explain, a feeling that this day might be different. Perhaps every soldier knows that feeling, the strange silence before violence, the moments when time seems to move more slowly, when every sound becomes clearer, when even the smallest details remain in your memory forever, the smell of damp earth, the weight of a musket against your shoulder, the leather reins of a horse, the warmth of a cup held between cold hands. History remembers battles. Those who fought them often remembered mornings. Napoleon rose early. Reports had already begun arriving from different parts of the army. Artillery officers described the condition of the ground. Cavalry commanders warned that movement would be difficult. Messengers rode back and forth across muddy roads, carrying information that was already beginning to grow old. Information has always traveled more slowly than events themselves. Even today, it struggles to keep pace. 200 years ago, that difference could decide the fate of nations. Napoleon listened carefully. He had fought enough campaigns to understand that impatience could be as dangerous as hesitation. His greatest victories had come through speed. But speed without preparation could become recklessness. The ground was still too soft. The heavy guns needed time. The army needed time. So he waited, perhaps only a little longer, perhaps longer than he should have. That question has divided historians ever since. For Napoleon, it was simply another decision, one made with the information available at that moment, not with the knowledge we possess today. Across the valley, Wellington was making decisions of his own. His position remained strong. His soldiers waited behind the reverse slope. Many were invisible to the French artillery. It was an elegant use of the landscape. The hills themselves had become part of his defense. They shielded men from cannon fire. They concealed movement. They forced Napoleon to fight against uncertainty. Wellington understood something essential. He did not need a spectacular victory. He only needed to survive. Every passing hour strengthened his position. Each passing hour gave his soldiers a little more rest. With every hour that passed, the chances of Prussian reinforcements grew. Napoleon needed time. Wellington needed even more of it. Both commanders were fighting the same battle, yet each measured success differently. One hoped to finish the battle quickly, the other hoped it would last. That quiet difference would shape everything that followed. Neither commander possessed perfect information. Neither could see the entire battlefield. Smoke had not yet covered the valley, but distance alone was enough to hide countless details. Every messenger carried only part of the truth. Every report revealed only one small piece of a much larger picture. No commander, no matter how gifted, could ever see the battle as clearly as future generations would. That is one of history's greatest illusions. History books allow us to observe everything at once. The people living through history never had that privilege. They saw only what lay before them. They heard only the reports that reached them. They made their decisions and only later discovered whether they had been right. As the morning slowly unfolded, the waiting became heavier. The silence grew shorter. The distance between peace and war grew smaller with every passing minute. Across the fields, thousands of soldiers looked toward an enemy they could barely see. Many would never meet face to face. Many would never know the names of the men standing opposite them. Yet within a few hours, their lives would become forever connected. The investigation had reached an important moment. The clues were beginning to align. The battlefield was prepared. The weather had played its part. The commanders had made their first decisions. Now only one thing remained. Someone had to fire the first shot, yet within a few hours their lives would become forever connected. The investigation had reached an important moment. The clues were beginning to align. The battlefield was prepared. The weather had played its part. The commanders had made their first decisions. Now only one thing remained. Someone had to fire the first shot. History has a curious habit. It remembers extraordinary people as though they were never ordinary at all. Napoleon Bonaparte is perhaps the greatest example. For more than 2 centuries, his name has become something larger than a man, a symbol, a legend, a warning, a genius, a tyrant. Depending on who tells the story, he has been all of these things. But on the morning of the 18th of June, he was simply a man carrying the weight of an empire. It is easy for us to forget that. Portraits show him standing proudly beneath imperial banners. Paintings capture him pointing confidently toward the battlefield. Statues cast him in bronze. Calm, certain, unshakable, reality is rarely so generous. Napoleon was 45 years old. By the standards of the 19th century, he was no longer young. He had spent more than 20 years living inside war, campaign after campaign, victory after victory, defeat after defeat. Few people in history had carried so much responsibility for so long. Every triumph demanded another campaign. Every campaign demanded another decision. Every decision carried thousands of lives. Even greatness has a price, and eventually, everyone pays it. Some historians believe Napoleon was suffering from illness during the Waterloo campaign. Others argue that exhaustion played the greater role. The evidence remains uncertain. What is certain is that he was no longer the energetic young general who had astonished Europe in Italy. Experience changes every commander. It teaches caution, it teaches patience, but it also leaves invisible scars. Every past mistake becomes another voice inside the mind. Every victory becomes another expectation. The burden of memory grows heavier with every passing year. Napoleon understood victory better than almost anyone alive. He also understood defeat. He had marched into Moscow. He had watched the Grand Army collapse. He had abdicated. He had crossed the sea into exile. He had escaped, returned, reclaimed his throne. And now only one campaign separated him from restoring his empire or losing it forever. No commander enters a battlefield carrying only maps and orders. They also carry memories, hope, regret, pride, fear, invisible companions walking beside them with every step. Napoleon was no different. Throughout the morning, reports continued to arrive. Some were encouraging, others less so. The ground remained heavy, the artillery required more time. The enemy remained largely hidden behind the ridge. Every report answered one question while raising 2 more. War has always produced uncertainty faster than certainty. There is another misunderstanding that often appears in popular history. People imagine great commanders making decisions instantly, as though genius leaves no room for hesitation. Reality is almost the opposite. The greater the responsibility, the greater the need to think carefully. Every order changes lives. Every delay changes possibilities. Sometimes, choosing not to act is itself the most important decision. Napoleon waited. Not because he lacked courage, not because he feared battle, but because he believed the moment had not yet arrived. Whether that judgment was correct is one of the questions our investigation will continue to explore. For now, we simply observe. The emperor stands before the battlefield. The valley lies silent. The smoke has not yet risen. The cannons have not yet spoken. History still holds its breath. And perhaps that is the final moment when the future could still have taken another path. Once the first gun fires, every choice becomes smaller. Every opportunity becomes fewer. Every mistake becomes more expensive. The battle has not yet begun, but already its outcome is quietly being shaped, not by destiny, not by luck, but by the ordinary decisions of ordinary human beings who have no idea which of their choices history will remember forever. every great commander depends upon the people around him. No emperor fights alone. No general wins a battle without trusting others to carry out his intentions. For Napoleon, few men inspired greater confidence than Marshal Michel Ney. His courage had become legendary long before Waterloo. Soldiers admired him, officers respected him, even his enemies acknowledged his fearlessness. Napoleon once described him with a phrase that would survive long after both men were gone: "The bravest of the brave." It is difficult to imagine a greater compliment from a commander who was not known for giving them lightly. Yet courage and judgment are not always the same thing. History has a habit of confusing the two. Michel Ney had earned every promotion through determination rather than privilege. He was not born into great wealth. He was not raised among Europe's ancient nobility. His rise came through ability, through persistence, through years spent proving himself on one battlefield after another. He fought in Italy, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia. He watched empires rise. He watched armies disappear beneath snow. He saw triumph. He saw catastrophe. Like Napoleon, he carried every campaign with him, invisible, but never forgotten. On the morning of Waterloo, Ney understood only one thing with certainty. The battle ahead would decide the future of France. Whether he fully grasped how history would judge his actions, no one can say. Perhaps it is better that he did not. Few people would dare to act at all if they knew their decisions would be examined for centuries. Throughout history, Marshal Ney has often been treated as one of Waterloo's principal culprits. His name appears whenever the conversation turns to missed opportunities, premature attacks, misunderstood orders, the famous cavalry charges. Again and again the accusation returns. Ney made the fatal mistakes. It is a powerful narrative, simple, direct, easy to remember. But every investigation teaches the same lesson. The most familiar explanation is not always the correct one. Before we decide whether Ney deserves blame, we must first understand the world as he experienced it, not the world preserved in books. The real one, the world of noise, smoke, confusion. Imagine standing on that battlefield, cannons firing without pause, thousands of muskets cracking through thick clouds of powder smoke, messengers arriving from every direction, some carrying urgent reports, others repeating information that had already become outdated, horses screaming in fear, officers shouting to make themselves heard above the thunder of artillery. Visibility shrank with every passing minute. No aerial view, no radio, no complete map of unfolding events, only fragments, only impressions, only instinct. That was the battlefield Ney inhabited. Every order he received was incomplete. Every decision relied on information that might already be wrong. And every minute, the battle changed. Historians often describe Waterloo as though every commander possessed perfect knowledge. They did not. Napoleon saw only part of the field. Wellington saw only part of the field. Ney saw even less. Each man tried to understand an event too large for any one person to comprehend. That is the tragedy of command. Responsibility expands faster than certainty. The higher a man rises, the less clearly he can see. Yet he must continue making decisions, whether he wishes to or not. There are moments in history when hesitation becomes dangerous. There are other moments when action becomes even more dangerous. The difficulty lies in recognizing which moment has arrived. No clock announces it, no signal appears. The decision belongs entirely to the person standing there, and once made, it cannot be recalled. Perhaps that is why we continue debating Michel Ney. Not because his choices were uniquely flawed, but because they remind us how fragile judgment becomes when certainty disappears. As investigators, we are not here to pronounce sentence, not yet. Our responsibility is simpler: to watch, to listen, to gather every piece of evidence before reaching a conclusion. Because somewhere within the smoke, within the confusion, within the countless decisions made by countless men, the truth still waits. Patiently, silently, as it has for more than 200 years. If Napoleon represented movement, Arthur Wellesley represented restraint. He was not a commander who sought admiration. He did not believe battles were won through spectacle. He believed they were won through preparation, patience, discipline, and the careful use of ground. That philosophy had followed him throughout his military career. Long before Waterloo, he had learned that the landscape itself could become an ally. A river could become a wall. A hill could become a shield. A narrow road could become a trap. The best battlefield was often the one that appeared perfectly ordinary. That was exactly what he found south of the village of Waterloo. The ridge was gentle, almost unimpressive. To an inexperienced eye, it looked like nothing more than another rise in the countryside. But Wellington saw something entirely different. He saw protection, he saw concealment, he saw time. His soldiers stood just behind the reverse slope. From the French position, many of them simply disappeared from view. Napoleon could see the ridge. He could not see what waited behind it. That single decision reduced the effectiveness of French artillery before the battle had truly begun. It forced the emperor to fight against uncertainty. And uncertainty is an enemy no commander can ever defeat completely. Wellington understood something else as well. He did not need a brilliant victory. He did not need to destroy Napoleon's army before sunset. His objective was far simpler: hold the line, remain in position, endure. Sometimes history celebrates the commander who advances. It rarely gives equal attention to the commander who refuses to move. Yet waiting demands a different kind of courage. Every passing hour brought new pressure. French artillery continued to fire. Attacks would come, casualties would rise, reports would grow increasingly confused. Still, the line had to hold. There is a quiet confidence that comes only from preparation, not certainty. Preparation. Wellington knew his army. He knew where each brigade stood. He knew which roads connected the farms. He knew how the ridge concealed his troops. Most importantly, he knew he was not alone. Somewhere to the east, Field Marshal Blucher continued marching toward the battlefield. The Prussian army had suffered a hard defeat only 2 days earlier. Many commanders might have expected them to retreat, to recover, to save themselves. Wellington believed otherwise. He trusted they would come. It was a remarkable act of faith, not blind optimism, but confidence built through communication and mutual commitment. That confidence shaped every decision he made. If the Prussians arrived, he needed only to survive. If they failed to arrive, everything would depend upon the endurance of his own army. That uncertainty remained with him throughout the day. Contrary to popular imagination, Wellington did not possess perfect knowledge. He could not see the Prussians. He could not know exactly where they were. Every report travelled across muddy roads. Every message consumed precious time. Like Napoleon, he made decisions inside uncertainty. The difference was not that one commander knew more than the other. The difference was how each chose to use the hours available. Napoleon sought the decisive blow. Wellington sought endurance. Napoleon measured opportunity. Wellington measured time. Both strategies possessed their own logic. Both had succeeded before. Only one would succeed here. Looking back across 2 centuries, it is tempting to imagine Waterloo as a contest between 2 extraordinary men. In truth, it was something more complex. It was a contest between 2 different ways of understanding war. One believed victory belonged to decisive action. The other believed victory belonged to patience. The battlefield would soon decide which philosophy would prevail. But before that answer could emerge, another witness was slowly approaching. He could not yet hear every cannon. He could not yet see the smoke rising above the ridge. Yet with every mile, his presence was becoming more important. His name was Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, and although he was still beyond the horizon, history was already moving in his direction. There is a moment in many great stories when the most important person is not the one standing at the center of the stage, but the one who has not yet arrived. On the morning of the 18th of June, that man was Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. At first glance, he hardly seemed destined to influence the fate of Napoleon's empire. He was 72 years old. His face bore the marks of a lifetime spent in military service. His body carried wounds from campaigns stretching back decades. He had fallen from his horse only 2 days earlier during the Battle of Ligny. For a time, many believed he had been killed. Others assumed he would never command again. Yet Blücher survived, bruised, exhausted, in pain, but alive, and most importantly, determined. After the defeat at Ligny, the Prussian army faced a decision that would shape the future of Europe: retreat eastward towards safety, or remain close enough to support Wellington. The easier choice would have been to withdraw, to regroup, to preserve what remained of the army. Many commanders throughout history had done exactly that. There would have been no shame in it. But Blücher chose another road. He ordered his army to march toward Waterloo, not because the journey would be easy. Quite the opposite. The roads were little more than rivers of mud. The rain had turned every mile into a struggle. Artillery sank into the earth. Supply wagons lagged behind. Horses stumbled through waterlogged fields. Entire columns slowed to the pace of exhausted men walking through heavy clay. Yet they continued, hour after hour, step after step. The Prussian soldiers understood remarkably little about the battle unfolding ahead. Most had no clear picture of Wellington's position. Few knew exactly where Napoleon's main army stood. They marched because they had been ordered to march. Sometimes history depends not upon perfect understanding, but upon simple determination. Communication between Allied armies in the 19th century was never certain. A message might arrive, or it might not. A courier might lose his way. He might be delayed. He might be captured. He might never arrive at all. Every promise carried risk. Every alliance depended upon trust. When Wellington chose to stand at Waterloo, he was placing enormous faith in that trust. He believed Blücher would come. Blücher believed Wellington would hold. Neither man possessed proof, only confidence built through shared hardship and mutual commitment. That confidence may have become one of the most valuable weapons either commander possessed. Meanwhile, Napoleon believed the Prussians had been effectively dealt with. Marshal Grouchy had been sent to pursue them. His task appeared straightforward: prevent the Prussian army from rejoining Wellington, separate the Allies, fight them one at a time. It was a strategy Napoleon had used successfully many times before. On paper, it remained entirely logical. But battlefields are not governed by paper. They are governed by time, distance, weather, chance, and the countless human decisions that no map can fully predict. Somewhere beyond the eastern forests, the Prussian columns continued their relentless march. They could not yet see Waterloo. They could not yet hear every cannon. But with each passing hour, the sound grew louder, the smoke rose higher, the urgency became greater. The road beneath their boots was no longer simply a road. It had become a path leading toward one of history's defining moments. The remarkable thing is this: none of those soldiers knew it. No one paused to admire the significance of the journey. No one announced they were marching into history. They were simply tired men following orders. trying to keep pace, trying not to fall behind. History rarely reveals itself to those who are living through it. It disguises itself as another mile, another village, another muddy road. Only later, when the dust has settled, do we look back and recognize the quiet importance of those ordinary moments. As the Prussian army pressed onward, the first reports from Waterloo began reaching Brücke. The battle had begun. Wellington was holding. For now. The march quickened, not because the road had become easier, but because every man understood that somewhere ahead another army was waiting for them, and every minute now carried the weight of an empire. There is a peculiar silence that exists only before a battle. It is not true silence. Men are talking. Horses are moving, wheels creak across damp ground, officers exchange quiet instructions. Somewhere, a blacksmith gives one final strike to a horseshoe. Somewhere else, a soldier folds a letter and places it carefully inside his coat. Life continues, almost normally, until it doesn't. Shortly before noon, the waiting finally came to an end. Somewhere along the French line, an artillery officer received a familiar command. Prepare the battery. The order itself was ordinary. It had been spoken thousands of times before. The gun crews knew exactly what to do. They had rehearsed every movement until it required almost no thought. The sponge cleared the barrel, powder was loaded. Then the cannonball. The rammer drove the charge into place. The vent was primed. Each movement followed the last with calm precision. War often appears chaotic from a distance. Up close it is strangely methodical. The men serving the guns did not think about history. They thought about procedure, about timing, about doing their work correctly, because mistakes around artillery were rarely forgiven. Then the first cannon fired. Its thunder rolled across the valley. Birds burst into the sky. The echo drifted across the hills before slowly fading into the distance. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire countryside had awakened. Then another gun fired, and another. Soon, the French batteries began speaking together, not in words, but in rhythm, a slow, relentless rhythm. Smoke spread across the valley, white clouds drifted over the fields, the clear morning air slowly disappeared behind powder and dust. The battlefield that had looked so peaceful only hours earlier was becoming something entirely different. Across the ridge, the Allied soldiers listened. Many of them remained out of sight, protected by the reverse slope Wellington had chosen so carefully. The cannonballs passed overhead. Some buried themselves harmlessly in the soft earth. Others struck the crest of the ridge before losing their force. The rain that had delayed Napoleon's attack now softened the impact of many French shots. Even the weather continued to influence the battle, often in ways no one had anticipated. For the men waiting behind the ridge, the opening bombardment brought an unexpected feeling. Relief. Not because they were safe, far from it, but because uncertainty had finally ended. Waiting asks difficult questions. Battle leaves little time for questions at all. Once the first shot is fired, the mind stops imagining the future. It becomes completely occupied with the present. Load, aim, fire, reload, survive. Those simple actions replace every larger thought. Meanwhile, Napoleon observed the opening phase from his command position. He searched the battlefield through drifting smoke. Reports arrived. Fresh batteries requested ammunition. Officers delivered news from different sectors. Already, the battle was becoming more difficult to understand. The first hour of any great battle is often the clearest. Every hour that follows becomes more uncertain. Smoke hides movement. Noise buries commands. Distance delays information. Every report describes a battlefield that no longer exists. By the time it reaches headquarters, the situation has already changed. That truth has remained constant throughout military history. Technology changes, weapons change, uniforms change, but uncertainty remains. No commander has ever escaped it. As the cannonade continued, the valley itself began to disappear. Fields vanished behind drifting smoke. Roads became impossible to distinguish. Even familiar landmarks faded into a grey haze. The landscape that had guided both armies all morning was slowly being erased. And when a battlefield disappears from sight, instinct begins replacing observation. Experience replaces certainty. Judgment replaces knowledge. That is when mistakes become most likely, not because commanders become careless, but because the world around them grows increasingly difficult to understand. The investigation had now crossed an invisible line. Everything we have examined so far, the rain, the ground, the hidden ridge, the waiting, the long march of the Prussians, all of it had prepared the stage. Now the actors had begun to move. And somewhere on the French right, beyond the drifting smoke, a quiet country estate was about to become the center of the day's first great struggle. Its name was Hougoumont. If you were standing on the battlefield that afternoon, there is a good chance you would never have guessed where the fiercest fighting would begin. Not the center, not the highest ground, not the place where history books would later draw their boldest arrows. Instead, it began around a country estate. Hougoumont. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. A farmhouse, a chapel, several barns, an orchard enclosed by thick hedges, high stone walls, heavy wooden gates, the sort of place travelers might pass without a second thought. Yet history has always possessed a curious sense of irony. Again and again, it chooses ordinary places to witness extraordinary events. Napoleon never intended Hougoumont to decide the battle. Its purpose was limited. A diversion. An attack designed to occupy Wellington's attention. If the Allied commander committed reserves to protect his right flank, the French might find an opportunity somewhere else. It was a reasonable idea. On paper, it made perfect sense. But battle has a habit of ignoring paper. Shortly after the artillery bombardment began, French infantry advanced toward the estate. They crossed open fields, still damp from the previous night's rain. Their officers expected resistance. They did not expect the struggle that followed. Behind the walls, the defenders waited. British guards, German soldiers of the King's German Legion, Nassau troops. Men from different nations, standing together for a single purpose: hold the position, nothing more, nothing less. The first exchange of musket fire shattered the morning calm. Smoke drifted through the orchard. Leaves fell from branches struck by bullets. Stone walls echoed beneath repeated volleys. Within minutes, the peaceful farmhouse disappeared behind powder smoke. The battle had found its first prison. Hougoumont was no longer simply a building. It had become a world of its own. Inside the walls, time seemed to move differently. The wider battle almost disappeared. The soldiers defending the estate knew little about events unfolding elsewhere. They could hear the distant thunder of artillery. They could sense the enormous battle surrounding them. Yet everything they cared about had narrowed to a few gates, a courtyard, several gardens, and stretches of stone wall. War often reduces the world to surprisingly small places. One doorway, one staircase, one section of road, one field. Everything beyond them faded into the background. For the French attackers, the estate appeared almost within reach. Again and again, fresh units pressed forward. Again and again, they were driven back. Each assault seemed close to success. Each failure encouraged another attempt. That is one of the great dangers of battle. Success always appears just one effort away. History is filled with commanders who committed more men, not because victory was certain, but because it seemed almost certain. Almost. It is one of the most dangerous words in military history. Almost captured, almost broken, almost won. Those few letters have consumed countless lives. Hour after hour, more French troops entered the struggle around Hougoumont. Some had never expected to fight there at all. Others believed they would remain only briefly. Instead, the estate continued drawing men toward itself, like a fire drawing moths through the darkness. Meanwhile, Wellington watched. He understood something Napoleon could not yet fully appreciate. Every French battalion attacking Hougoumont was a battalion unavailable somewhere else. Every officer concentrating on the farmhouse was an officer no longer directing attention toward the center. Every minute spent here quietly strengthened the rest of the Allied line. The remarkable thing is that neither commander intended this outcome. Napoleon had ordered a diversion. The battle transformed it into something much larger. Waterloo was beginning to develop a character of its own. The commanders still issued orders. But the battlefield had started answering back. That happens more often than we imagine. Battles possess momentum. Once created, it becomes increasingly difficult to control. Every decision produces another. Every movement demands a response. Every response creates a new problem. Soon, even the best plans begin following the battle instead of leading it. By early afternoon, Hougoumont was no longer a secondary engagement. It had become a battle within the battle. Thousands of soldiers had already fought for ground measuring only a few hundred yards. The smoke hanging above the estate could be seen across much of the battlefield. It stood as a silent reminder that even the smallest places can consume extraordinary amounts of human effort. Our investigation has uncovered another important clue. Not a dramatic mistake, not a brilliant maneuver, something quieter, something easier to overlook. The battle was beginning to pull French strength away from its original purpose. One decision was slowly creating another and another. Without anyone realizing it, the shape of the entire battle was already beginning to change. There comes a moment in every great battle when no one truly controls it anymore. Orders continue to be written, messengers continue to ride, generals continue to make decisions, yet the battle itself begins making decisions of its own. Waterloo had reached that moment. What had begun as a carefully prepared plan was slowly becoming something else. Every attack created unexpected consequences. Every success revealed a new difficulty. Every delay forced another choice. The battle was no longer following a straight line. It had become a web of countless decisions, each connected to the next. Hougoumont was the first sign. The fighting refused to end. French commanders continued committing fresh troops. The defenders continued resisting. Neither side seemed willing to yield. What had been intended as a demonstration was quietly becoming an obsession. History often speaks about momentum, but momentum is rarely dramatic. It grows slowly, almost invisibly. One additional battalion, one more battery of guns, one more order, one more attempt. Each decision seems reasonable on its own. Only later, when viewed together, do they reveal the larger pattern. Napoleon remained focused on the greater battle. His objective still lay ahead, the center of Wellington's line, the place where he believed the decisive breakthrough could be achieved. Yet every report arriving from Hougoumont carried the same message. The position still held. More resistance, more casualties, more time. Time. The invisible resource that could never be replaced. Gold can be recovered. Weapons can be manufactured. Soldiers can be reinforced. Time, once spent, disappears forever. Across the battlefield, Wellington noticed the same pattern. He understood that Hougoumont had become more valuable than he had ever expected, not because of the buildings themselves, but because of the attention they demanded. Every French officer studying the farmhouse was an officer not studying another part of the battlefield. Every regiment committed there reduced the strength available elsewhere. Sometimes, victory comes not from destroying the enemy, but from persuading him to spend his strength where it matters least. It is a quieter form of success, one that often passes unnoticed in the middle of battle. Only afterward does its importance become clear. The soldiers fighting inside Hougoumont understood none of this. They were not thinking about Napoleon's strategy or Wellington's intentions. They thought about surviving the next minute, the next volley, the next assault. History often asks ordinary people to carry extraordinary burdens, without ever explaining why. Perhaps that is one of its greatest cruelties. The defenders did not know they were protecting the right flank of an army. The attackers did not know they were becoming part of a costly diversion. They knew only the wall before them, the smoke around them, the comrades beside them. Sometimes that is all war allows a man to know. By now, the battlefield sounded different. The opening cannonade had settled into a constant rhythm. Musket fire echoed from farms and orchards. Officers shouted through clouds of powder smoke. The cries of wounded horses drifted across the valley. What had once been separate sounds were becoming one continuous voice, the voice of battle itself. Yet beyond the smoke, beyond the noise, beyond the confusion, the larger story continued unfolding. French infantry waited for new orders. The Allied centre remained unbroken. Far to the east, the Prussians continued marching. Most men on the battlefield remained unaware of just how important that distant march would become. History often advances quietly, long before anyone notices its footsteps. As the afternoon drew nearer, the investigation revealed another uncomfortable truth. Waterloo was not being decided by one dramatic mistake. It was being shaped by dozens of ordinary decisions, each one understandable, each one reasonable, each one carrying consequences no one could fully foresee. That is why great battles continue to fascinate us, not because they are simple, but because they remind us how impossible it is to see the whole picture while standing inside it. The next great test was approaching, not on the right flank, but near the centre. There, another modest farmhouse stood waiting. Its walls had not yet witnessed the worst of the fighting, but before the day was over, its name would become inseparable from Waterloo itself. La Haie-Sainte. If Hougoumont guarded Wellington's right, La Haie-Sainte stood much closer to his heart. It was not a castle, not a fortress, not a great military stronghold. It was another farmhouse, another collection of stone buildings, surrounded by fields that only days before had belonged to farmers rather than soldiers. Yet location has always possessed extraordinary power. A single bridge can change a campaign. A narrow pass can stop an army. A farmhouse, standing in exactly the right place, can shape the outcome of an entire battle. La Haie-Sainte occupied ground that neither commander could afford to ignore. From its walls, the approaches toward the Allied centre could be watched. The roads could be observed. French movements became easier to report. As long as the farmhouse remained in Allied hands, any advance toward the centre became more difficult. Its defenders understood that. The French understood it as well. Unlike Hougoumont, which had begun almost as a diversion, La Haie-Sainte carried strategic importance from the very beginning. The men defending the farmhouse belonged primarily to the King's German Legion. Many of them had served together for years. They were experienced soldiers, disciplined, reliable, not because they lacked fear, but because experience had taught them how to continue despite it. There is an important difference. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep moving after fear has arrived. Throughout history, that decision has belonged not only to famous generals, but to ordinary soldiers whose names disappeared long ago. Inside La Haie-Sainte, no one spoke about glory. They spoke about ammunition, food, water, fields of fire, defensible walls, the practical details upon which survival always depends. History often celebrates brilliant strategy, Yet battles are frequently decided by simple logistics. A musket without ammunition is little more than a piece of wood and metal. A hungry soldier cannot march forever. An exhausted horse cannot pull another gun. Empires rise through ambition. They survive through supply. As the afternoon progressed, French pressure increased. Artillery continued firing. Columns of infantry advanced through drifting smoke. The defenders answered with disciplined volleys. Again and again, the attacks were repelled. Again and again, the farmhouse remained in Allied hands. But every successful defense carried a hidden cost. Every shot fired reduced the remaining ammunition. Every passing hour made resupply more difficult. The smoke that protected the defenders also concealed the roads. Messengers struggled to move. Supply wagons hesitated. Orders arrived late. The battle had become so large that even small distances seemed impossible to cross. 100 yards could feel like a mile. Meanwhile, Napoleon continued searching for the decisive opportunity. He knew Wellington's army had not yet broken. He knew time was slipping away. He also knew that somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, the Prussians still existed. Exactly where they were, no one could say with complete confidence. But uncertainty itself had become dangerous. Every commander fears the enemy he cannot see. The unseen opponent forces imagination to work harder than observation. Sometimes imagination exaggerates danger. Sometimes it fails to recognize it. Both mistakes can prove fatal. By mid-afternoon, La Haye-Sainte had become more than a farmhouse. It had become a hinge, a point upon which the balance of the battlefield seemed to rest. Neither side could ignore it. Neither side could easily capture or abandon it. The struggle continued, patiently, relentlessly, like two tides meeting against an immovable shore. And while thousands of men fought over stone walls and narrow courtyards, the larger battle continued changing around them. The French line stretched forward. The Allied line bent, but did not break. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of cannon fire seemed different. Fainter, then louder again. Few men noticed. Fewer still understood what it meant. Far beyond the smoke, beyond the forests, beyond the villages hidden among the rolling hills, another army was drawing closer. With every passing mile, its arrival became less a possibility and more an inevitability. The investigation had uncovered another piece of evidence, not a dramatic revelation, not a single fatal mistake, another quiet truth. Battles are often decided long before one side realizes the balance has begun to change. The signs are small, almost invisible. A delay, a shortage of ammunition, a position that refuses to fall, a distant army still marching. Taken separately, they seem unimportant. Taken together, they begin to reveal the shape of history itself. And as the afternoon deepened, the moment Napoleon had been waiting for all day seemed finally to arrive. The center still stood, but perhaps, just perhaps, one powerful blow would be enough to break it. The order that followed would become one of the most controversial decisions in military history. There comes a moment in every battle when waiting is no longer enough. By early afternoon, Napoleon believed that moment had arrived. For hours, the French artillery had pounded the Allied position. Hougoumont continued to burn on the right. La Haye-Sainte remained under constant pressure. The battlefield had been tested, measured, observed. Now, it was time for the first great assault. The responsibility fell to the I Corps, nearly 17,000 men under the command of General Jean-Baptiste d'Erlon. It was one of the largest infantry formations on the field. 4 divisions, thousands of bayonets, thousands of muskets, an immense body of men stretching across the landscape. When viewed from a distance, their advance must have seemed unstoppable. The drums began first, a slow, steady rhythm. Then came the movement. Rank after rank, the French infantry stepped forward, not running, not shouting, simply marching, disciplined, deliberate, confident. There is something deeply unsettling about an army advancing in silence. No dramatic speeches, no heroic gestures, only thousands of synchronized footsteps moving toward uncertainty. Each soldier knew only a small part of the plan. Most had never seen the entire battlefield. Many could not even see Napoleon. They followed the flags, the drums, the officers ahead of them. That is how armies move, not through perfect understanding, but through trust. As the columns descended into the valley, the ground reminded them of yesterday's storm. Mud still clung to their boots. Artillery wheels had carved deep scars across the fields. The advance remained steady, but never effortless. Every step demanded energy. Every yard required determination. Across the ridge, the Allied soldiers waited, hidden, silent, invisible. The reverse slope continued to conceal much of Wellington's army. From below, the French could see only fragments. A few guns, scattered skirmishers, occasional movement along the crest. What lay beyond remained unknown. That uncertainty mattered. Every commander fears the position he cannot fully observe. Every soldier fears the enemy he cannot yet see. Still, the advance continued. Closer, closer still. Then the ridge came alive. British infantry rose almost as one. What had appeared to be an empty hillside suddenly revealed lines of red uniforms. Volley after volley crashed into the advancing French columns. Smoke erupted along the crest. The silence vanished. For the first time that day, the assault met the full weight of Wellington's defense. The French continued forward. Some units reached the crest, others faltered, officers shouted fresh orders, drummers struggled to keep formation, standards remained upright, then disappeared into the smoke. History often describes battles as clashes between armies. In reality, they are collisions between human decisions. One commander chooses to advance, another chooses to wait. One officer orders another attack. Another orders his men to hold their fire until the final possible moment. Each decision lasts only seconds. Its consequences may last forever. For a brief time, the outcome remained uncertain. French soldiers pressed against the Allied line. The defenders gave ground in places. The center seemed to bend. Perhaps, just perhaps, Napoleon's calculation had been correct. Then the battlefield revealed another surprise, one that no infantry column ever wishes to see. From behind the ridge, cavalry began to emerge. Not scattered horsemen, not reconnaissance patrols, heavy cavalry. Large men mounted on powerful horses. Their helmets caught the afternoon light. Their swords remained lowered. For only a moment, everything seemed strangely quiet again. The French infantry had marched forward, expecting to meet muskets. Instead, they now faced something entirely different. The next few minutes would become some of the most dramatic of the entire battle, not because of a single brilliant command, but because events were now moving faster than anyone could fully control. The investigation had reached another turning point. The first great French assault had begun. It had come closer to success than many would later remember. Yet the battlefield was already preparing its reply. And it would arrive at full gallop. There is a sound every infantryman learns to fear. Not a cannon, not a musket, but the thunder of approaching hooves. The vibration reached the ground first. Then the horses appeared. By the time many French soldiers realized what was happening, it was already too late. From behind Wellington's ridge, the British heavy cavalry surged forward. Not in scattered groups, not in cautious reconnaissance, but as one overwhelming force. The Union Brigade, for hours they had waited behind the reverse slope, hidden from French observation, watching, listening, waiting. Now, their moment had come. General Sir William Ponsonby gave the order. The brigade began to move, first at a walk, then a trot, then a full charge. The ground shook beneath hundreds of powerful horses, steel helmets flashed beneath the afternoon sun, long swords remained lowered. Every second, the distance between cavalry and infantry disappeared. For the men of d'Erlon's corps, the attack seemed to come from nowhere. Only moments before, their attention had been fixed on the Allied infantry ahead. Now, an entirely different danger burst through the smoke. French officers shouted the same command again and again, "Form square! Form square!" It was the only formation capable of stopping heavy cavalry, a wall of bayonets, steady ranks, discipline stronger than fear. But battle rarely allows perfect timing. Some battalions had already lost formation while climbing the ridge, others were still advancing, others heard the warning too late. Not every unit managed to form square. Those that failed found themselves completely exposed. The collision was sudden, violent, confused. Heavy horses smashed into broken formations. Long swords swept through the smoke. French standards vanished beneath the chaos. Within moments, the battlefield became impossible to read. History often remembers cavalry charges as glorious spectacles. Reality was something very different. Smoke hid almost everything. Noise drowned every command. Many soldiers could no longer tell where the front line ended or where the enemy began. For a few extraordinary minutes, the Union Brigade dominated the battlefield. French battalions began to retreat. Others attempted to regroup. Some abandoned their positions altogether. From Wellington's Ridge, the charge appeared to be a complete success. It had broken the momentum of d'Erlon's assault. Perhaps it had saved the Allied centre, but Waterloo had already taught us something important. Every success creates a new danger. The British cavalry continued forward, past the shattered infantry, past the ridge, past the position they had been ordered to recover. Momentum replaced discipline. The riders saw retreating French soldiers, abandoned guns, broken formations. They continued the pursuit, farther, farther still. Meanwhile, French officers were already restoring order. Artillery crews returned to their batteries. Fresh cavalry assembled behind the French line. The battlefield was changing once again. What had looked like a decisive British victory was becoming something far less certain. The investigation had uncovered another pattern. At Waterloo, no advantage lasted for long. Every victory demanded another decision. Every decision created another risk. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the French cavalry was already preparing its answer. The next collision would belong to the horsemen. Victory can be dangerous, sometimes more dangerous than defeat. For a few brief moments it seemed the British cavalry had changed everything. The French attack had stalled. d'Erlon's corps had fallen into confusion. Cannons stood abandoned. Infantry scattered across the fields. The charge had achieved far more than anyone expected. But battles rarely reward momentum for long. Success has a dangerous habit. It encourages men to keep going. The Union Brigade continued its pursuit. Past the broken French battalions, past the captured guns, farther from Wellington's Ridge, farther from the infantry that had supported the charge. Every stride carried the horsemen deeper into uncertainty. Many believed the French were collapsing. Many believed victory was within reach. But the battlefield was telling a different story. Beyond the drifting smoke, French officers were already restoring order. Broken battalions began forming once again. Artillery crews returned to their guns. Fresh cavalry assembled behind the line. Napoleon had not lost control. Not yet. He still possessed one great advantage: reserve cavalry. Fresh, organized, waiting for the right moment. Marshal Ney saw the opportunity almost immediately. The British horsemen had ridden too far, their formations had stretched apart, their speed had become their weakness. Now the hunters were becoming the hunted. French trumpets sounded across the field, fresh squadrons began to move, not in panic, not in desperation, but with purpose. Steel flashed through the smoke, thousands of horses accelerated together. The distance closed rapidly. The exhausted British cavalry barely had time to regroup. Many riders turned only when they heard the approaching thunder behind them. For one terrifying moment, both sides understood exactly what was about to happen. Neither could stop it. Two cavalry forces, both committed, both moving at full speed, both believing they could still decide the battle. The second great collision of the afternoon had begun. The battlefield never truly pauses. Even when it seems to breathe, it is only preparing for the next strike. After the chaos of the cavalry engagements, something quieter began to return, something heavier, more deliberate: the artillery. For a brief time, the guns had fallen silent, not because they were defeated, but because the battlefield had moved too quickly for them to follow. Now they were coming back, the French batteries reformed along the ridge. One by one, the guns returned to position. Powder was carried forward, shot was lifted once again, the rhythm of war returned. Slow, methodical, relentless. Napoleon understood this rhythm better than anyone. Cavalry could break lines, infantry could hold ground. But artillery shaped the entire battlefield. The first gun fired, then another, until the entire ridge erupted in fire and smoke. The sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder, but this was not nature, it was precision. Measured destruction, repeated without pause. Wellington's soldiers once again faced the pressure they had endured all morning. But something had changed. The battlefield was no longer one decisive moment. It had become a cycle. Attack, break, recover, repeat. Each side learning, each side adapting, each side refusing to collapse. The investigation reveals a pattern. Waterloo was not a battle of one great charge or one decisive mistake. It was a battle of endurance, a battle of systems under pressure, of commanders trying to restore order faster than their enemy could destroy it. Napoleon was trying to maintain momentum. Wellington was trying to preserve structure. And between them, the artillery ensured that neither side could fully succeed. But even artillery cannot decide everything, because somewhere beyond the smoke, something was still moving, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. A sound that had been expected but never guaranteed. The sound of an approaching army, and for the first time the battlefield began to change in a way no cannon could control. The investigation was no longer focused only on Napoleon or Wellington or Ney. Now it had to include the man who was still out of sight. But already, changing everything, Blücher was coming. And still, the battle was not over. Neither side had broken. Neither commander had achieved the result he wanted. But something was changing beyond the battlefield. Far to the east, another army was moving. Slowly at first, then with purpose, the Prussians. Blücher's army had begun its march toward Waterloo. For hours they had been fighting and retreating across difficult ground. But now they were advancing again. Every step carried weight. Every road brought them closer to the sound of guns. Napoleon had known this was possible, but he had chosen to gamble, to defeat Wellington before the Prussians could arrive. That gamble was still in motion, but time was no longer neutral. It was becoming an enemy. French officers began to notice movement on the horizon. Reports arrived slowly, uncertain, conflicting. But the pattern was becoming clear. Something was approaching from the east, something large, something organized. The battlefield was no longer a single front. It was beginning to stretch, to widen, to divide. Wellington held the ridge, Napoleon held the center, but now a third force was entering the equation, and nothing at Waterloo would ever be simple again. The battlefield changes before anyone is truly ready for it, not through announcements, not through clear orders, but through fragments of information arriving too late. By midday, something was already wrong on the French right. The battlefield changes before anyone is truly ready for it, not through announcements, not through clear orders, but through fragments of information arriving too late. By midday, something was already wrong on the French right. Napoleon's plan depended on separation. Two enemies, two directions, two isolated battles. But war rarely respects separation. It reconnects what commanders struggle to divide. Bit by bit, the eastern horizon filled with movement. First indistinct, then undeniable. Dark columns crossed the landscape, infantry, cavalry, artillery, all advancing, all converging. French commanders hesitated, not because they lacked courage, but because certainty had disappeared. Every message carried doubt, every observation demanded interpretation, and interpretation is where mistakes begin. Napoleon still believed he had time to finish Wellington, time to break the Allied center, time to decide the battle before it widened. But time was no longer his ally. It was splitting between west and east, between two armies, between two armies, between two fronts. The first confirmation arrived quietly, a report from the Eastern cavalry screen, then another, and another, each more urgent than the last. The Prussians were no longer simply marching, they were closing in. The sound of distant artillery could already be heard on the far edge of the field, not loud, not yet, but real. For Napoleon, this was not yet a crisis, but it was no longer an assumption. It was confirmation. The battle had expanded beyond the plan, beyond control, beyond a single field of action. Wellington held the ridge in silence. Napoleon pressed forward with urgency, and from the east, a third army was entering the geometry of war, slowly, irreversibly. And now, the outcome would no longer depend on a single decision. It would depend on whether any commander could react quickly enough to a battlefield that was no longer willing to wait. There are moments in war when everything that once seemed stable suddenly isn't. Not because of a single explosion, not because of a single ord, but because reality itself begins to shift. By the time the first reports reached the French headquarters, the battlefield was already changing shape. The Prussians were no longer a distant possibility. They had become a direction with weight, with movement, with inevitability. Napoleon received the news quietly, no reaction, no visible change, only calculation. Because by now, reaction was no longer simple. Every option carried risk, every delay carried consequences, every movement could weaken another part of the line. The battlefield was no longer one problem, it had become several, simultaneous, competing, unstable. To the west, Wellington still held a silent ridge of resistance. At the center, French pressure continued. Artillery and infantry locked in a relentless rhythm. To the east, something new was taking shape, something that could no longer be ignored. French officers began speaking with greater urgency. Orders became shorter, movements became faster. But clarity did not improve, it diminished. Because now, information itself was arriving too late to matter. A message sent that morning described a battlefield that no longer existed. A report from only minutes earlier already belonged to the past. This is how battles fracture, not in space, but in time. Napoleon understood this better than most, but understanding it did not make it easier to stop. He had committed himself to one decisive strike against Wellington before the Prussians could fully intervene. That attack was still unfolding, still in motion, still incomplete, and now a second front was beginning to open behind it. Slowly, relentlessly, uncontrollably. The French army was no longer operating in one direction, it was being asked to fight in three, and no army in history can truly do that, not without cost, not without risk, not without cost, not without risk, not without consequence. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the sound of marching continued to grow louder. Not yet a threat, not yet an impact, but an arrival. And arrival is always the moment when possibility ends and reality begins. War rarely changes through one event. It changes through accumulation, through pressure building in places that were never supposed to matter. By now, the French command could no longer treat the battlefield as a single engagement. What had begun as an attack on Wellington was becoming something larger, unstable, expanding. The reports from the east were no longer uncertain, they had become consistent. The Prussians were advancing, not cautiously, not hesitantly, but relentlessly, step by step, hour by hour. Napoleon's attention began to divide, not willingly, but inevitably, because no commander can ignore a second army. Moving toward his flank, French units began adjusting their positions, subtly at first, then more visibly. Cavalry screens shifted eastward, messages moved faster. Reserves were viewed differently, but every adjustment came at a price. To strengthen one direction was to weaken another. To hold the center was to stretch the flanks. To continue the attack on Wellington was to risk exposure to the Prussians. And so the French army entered a state of tension that could not be resolved. Only managed. To the west, the battle looked unchanged. Smoke, fire, stubborn resistance. But beneath the surface, the structure was becoming fragile. To the east, the Prussian presence was no longer theoretical, it was approaching, and every mile they advanced reduced Napoleon's margin for error. Time was no longer abstract. It had become distance, measured in the space between armies, measured in minutes before contact, measured in decisions that could no longer be delayed. Napoleon understood the situation, but understanding did not provide solutions, only clarity. And clarity, without control, can become its own form of pressure. The battlefield was now divided in three ways: Wellington holding, Napoleon striking, Blucher approaching, each dependent on the others in ways none of them had intended. And somewhere within that structure, the outcome of the entire campaign was already beginning to form, quietly, irreversibly, without permission from anyone involved. There are moments in battle when distance no longer means safety, it becomes pressure. By now, the French position had begun to tighten, not because Napoleon wanted it, but because the battlefield itself demanded it. The Prussians were no longer a distant movement on the horizon, they were approaching contact, not yet fully engaged, but no longer avoidable. French commanders adjusted once again, cavalry units shifted eastward, messages moved faster, reserves were reconsidered, but every adjustment came at a cost. Because nothing in war is ever added for free, everything is taken from somewhere else. To reinforce one direction is to weaken another. To defend the east is to thin the center. To continue the attack on Wellington is to risk collapse from behind. Napoleon understood this, but understanding does not equal control. The original plan depended on speed, break Wellington before Blucher arrived, but speed requires unity, and unity was beginning to fracture. The battlefield was no longer aligned, it was bending under multiple pressures. To the west, Wellington remained unchanged, a steady line of endurance behind the ridge. At the center, the French attack still pressed forward, but with increasing strain. To the east, the Prussians were no longer approaching, they were beginning to shape the battle. French officers spoke less about victory and more about position, about angles, about timing, about preserving the line, because the line had become the most fragile thing they possessed. Information itself had become unreliable, reports arrived late, interpretations conflicted, certainty no longer existed, only probability, and probability is rarely enough in a collapsing system. Napoleon still pushed forward. The center remained his focus, Wellington remained his target, but the battlefield was no longer centered. It was beginning to disperse, slowly, then suddenly, and somewhere beyond the smoke, the first elements of a second army were now close enough to influence the battle, not yet decisive, but already present, and presence is often enough to change everything. The investigation had reached a critical point. The battle was no longer about one decision, it was about whether any decision could still hold together, as the battlefield itself was coming apart. By this point, the battlefield was no longer stable in any traditional sense. It was being pulled in two directions at once, not metaphorically, but physically, across ground, across time, across command decisions that could no longer be separated. The Prussians were no longer a distant movement on the horizon. They were approaching contact, not yet fully engaged, but no longer avoidable. French commanders adjusted once again. Cavalry units shifted eastward, messages moved faster, reserves were reconsidered, but every adjustment came at a cost, because nothing in war is ever added for free. Everything is taken from somewhere else. To reinforce one direction is to weaken another. To defend the east is to thin the center. To continue the attack on Wellington is to risk collapse from behind. Napoleon understood this. But understanding does not equal control. The original plan depended on speed. Break Wellington before Blücher arrived. But speed requires unity, and unity was beginning to fracture. The battlefield was no longer aligned, it was bending under multiple pressures. To the west, Wellington remained unchanged, a steady line of endurance behind the ridge. At the center, the French attack still pressed forward, but with increasing strain. To the east, the Prussians were no longer approaching, they were beginning to shape the battle. French officers spoke less about victory and more about position, about angles, about timing, about preserving the line, because the line had become the most fragile thing they possessed. Information itself had become unreliable. Reports arrived late, interpretations conflicted, certainty no longer existed, only probability, and probability is rarely enough in a collapsing system. Napoleon still pushed forward, the center remained his focus, Wellington remained his target, but the battlefield was no longer centered, it was beginning to disperse, slowly, then suddenly, and somewhere beyond the smoke, the first elements of a second army were now close enough to influence the battle, not yet decisive, but already present, and presence is often enough to change everything. The investigation had reached a critical point. The battle was no longer about one decision. It was about whether any decision could still hold together. As the battlefield itself was coming apart, there are moments in battle when pressure stops being invisible and becomes visible collapse. By now, the French center was beginning to feel that pressure directly, not as theory, but as resistance. Wellington's line had not moved. It had simply absorbed everything thrown against it, hour after hour, attack after attack, wave after wave, and it was still there, holding, unbroken. French infantry began to slow, not because they were defeated, but because exhaustion had reached the army itself. Men could advance only so far before the cost of each step became too great. Officers noticed it first. Then the soldiers felt it. Momentum was fading, not collapsing, but weakening, and in battle, weakening is often the beginning of failure. At the same time, pressure from the east increased again. The Prussians were no longer arriving in theory, they were forcing decisions on the ground. French outlying positions began to give way, small units fell back faster than planned. Communication broke into fragments. The battlefield was no longer coherent, it was breaking into local fights, isolated decisions, independent crises. Napoleon was now facing the consequence of scale. An army can be controlled until it can no longer act as one body. After that point, it becomes something else entirely. The center was still the key, but it was no longer stable. Pressure from Wellington remained constant. Pressure from the Prussians kept increasing, and between them, the French army was being compressed, not destroyed. Compressed, every direction reduced space, every movement narrowed the options, every decision created vulnerability somewhere else. Napoleon's system was still functioning, but it was functioning under growing strain. And now, something inside that system began to fail, not suddenly, but structurally. The battlefield was no longer resisting, it was starting to give way, not in one place, but across multiple points at once. And that is the most dangerous form of collapse, because it cannot be fixed with a single order, only delayed. The investigation had reached a critical threshold, because what happened next would determine not only the outcome of this battle, but the end of the system that had created it. The battlefield does not collapse in one direction, it collapses wherever the pressure is greatest. By now, that pressure was no longer theoretical. It was physical. On the French eastern flank, the Prussians were no longer approaching. They were arriving. In contact, in conflict, in reality, small engagements began to spread along the edge of the battlefield. Outposts were overwhelmed, skirmish lines were pushed back, reports turned into urgency, urgency turned into disruption, and disruption became instability. French commanders tried to respond, but every response required time, and time was already being consumed elsewhere. To the west, Wellington still held, a fixed point of resistance, unmoving, silent, absorbing pressure without breaking. At the center, the French attack continued. But every advance now cost more than the last. Men continued forward, but more slowly, more heavily, less coordinated. Momentum was no longer growing, it was dissolving. And in war, once momentum begins to dissolve, it rarely returns. Napoleon was now forced into constant adjustment, not strategic maneuver, but reactive correction. Every message from the east demanded attention, every report from the center demanded action. Every delay increased uncertainty. The army was no longer acting as one system. It was becoming several systems, operating under conflicting demands. And no command structure, no matter how experienced, can fully stabilize that condition. The Prussians advanced farther, step by step, unit by unit. They were no longer a secondary threat. They were now part of the battlefield itself. And as they advanced, they began reshaping the battlefield. French positions along the eastern edge gave way in sequence, not all at once, but in fragments. Each fragment reduced the strength available elsewhere. Each loss tightened the pressure on the center. It was not a breakthrough, it was compression. And compression is slower than collapse, but far more certain. Napoleon now faced a battlefield that no longer behaved according to plan. It behaved according to momentum, and momentum was no longer under his control. The center could still hold, but only if nothing else changed, and everything was changing. The investigation now reveals the final structural truth of this phase of the battle. The French army was no longer fighting one enemy. It was fighting space itself, and space had begun to close. By now, the center of the French army was no longer operating as a single body. It was stretching, not breaking, not yet, but losing cohesion, unit by unit, decision by decision, step by step. Wellington's position remained unchanged, a constant wall of resistance behind the ridge, silent, hidden, unmoving, but impossible to dislodge. French infantry continued to press forward, but pressure no longer produced the same result. Each advance became shorter. Every gain proved temporary. Every step forward required more effort than the last, and every effort achieved less than before. At the same time, the eastern flank was no longer secondary. The Prussians were now fully engaged, not as a distant force, but as active pressure on French positions. Every French unit pulled eastward, weakened the centre. Every reinforcement sent to the centre delayed the response in the east. There was no perfect balance, only shifting instability. Napoleon's command structure continued to adapt, but adaptation itself had become the burden, because nothing stabilized, everything moved, everything reacted, nothing settled, and in that condition, control becomes an illusion. French officers began to notice something even more dangerous than enemy movement: inconsistency within their own lines. Units arriving late, orders misunderstood, positions abandoned too early or too late, not collapse, but fragmentation. The battlefield was now moving at different speeds. The west remained static. The center endured constant pressure. The east accelerated toward contact. 3 speeds, 1 army, and that mismatch was becoming decisive. Napoleon remained focused on the center, still pressing toward Wellington. But the battlefield no longer followed a single direction of intent. It responded to local pressure, not to grand strategy. And that shift is where command begins to lose its meaning. The Prussians continued to close, not dramatically, but irreversibly, and every step they took reduced the French margin for recovery. The center could still hold, but only briefly. And briefly is often all that remains before the structure gives way. The center could still hold, but only briefly, and briefly is often all that remains before the structure gives way. The investigation now approaches the moment when pressure stops being distributed and begins to concentrate. There comes a point in every battle when pressure can no longer be shared. It has to be carried entirely by the weakest part of the line. By now, the French army had reached that point. The center was no longer absorbing pressure evenly. It was concentrating it, not by design, but by necessity. Wellington's line remained unchanged, still anchored behind the ridge, still refusing to break, still forcing the French into repeated attacks that became more costly with every attempt. To the east, the Prussians were no longer applying pressure from a distance. They were shaping the battlefield directly. Engagements now spread continuously along the flank. French units were forced to turn outward, then back again, then outward again. Each adjustment created delay. Each delay created vulnerability, and vulnerability spread. French commanders tried to compensate. Reserves were redirected, orders were rewritten, positions were adjusted. But every correction created imbalance somewhere else. The army was no longer functioning as a single force. It had become a chain of reactions, independent, simultaneous, unstable. Napoleon could still see the center clearly, but clarity no longer guaranteed control, because control depends not on vision, but on synchronization, and synchronization was breaking apart. Slowly at first, then across multiple points at once. French infantry in the center began to lose alignment, not through panic, but through exhaustion. Units arrived at different times. Attacks formed unevenly. Pressure no longer came in waves. It came in fragments, and fragments do not break strong positions quickly. But they do something else. They wear them down, slowly, relentlessly, irreversibly. To the west, Wellington still held. To the east, the Prussians continued to arrive, and at the centre, the French army was being forced into an ever narrower field of action. Every option narrowed, every movement became constrained, every decision heavier than the last, and now, for the first time, the battlefield was no longer expanding, it was tightening. And when a battlefield tightens, there always comes a moment when something has to give. It does not begin with collapse, it begins with a mistake that no one can immediately correct. By now, the French centre was under constant strain. Pressure from the west, pressure from the east, and pressure that no longer allowed time for correction. Wellington's line remained intact, still anchored, still absorbing, still refusing to yield. But the cost of each French assault kept rising, not in numbers alone, but in cohesion. One battalion failed to align properly during a coordinated assault. At first it seemed minor, a delay, a misstep, a pause in movement. But in battle, timing is everything, because timing creates cohesion, and cohesion keeps an army alive. That battalion moved too late, and in doing so, it exposed the formation beside it, which exposed another, which disrupted the line behind it. On the surface, nothing had collapsed, but beneath the surface, coordination had failed, and once coordination fails, pressure becomes uneven. Uneven pressure becomes fracture. To the east, the Prussians continued to press forward, no longer distant, now engaging directly with French screening units. Skirmishes turned into engagements, engagements turned into pressure points became withdrawals. Napoleon's response was immediate, but it was no longer decisive, because every adjustment opened another gap, every reinforcement left another sector exposed, every correction solved one problem and created another. The battlefield was no longer balanced, it was cascading, slowly, then visibly, then everywhere at once. Wellington remained unchanged. But now, even his stillness mattered, because the French no longer had enough cohesion to concentrate fully on him. The centre was no longer truly a centre, it was becoming a collection of unstable points, each one under pressure, each one reacting differently, each one losing synchronization with the others. And in war, when the centre stops acting as a centre, the outcome is already being decided. Not suddenly, but structurally. By now, control was no longer held in one place, it had become distributed. And distribution is the first step toward losing it. The French command structure was still functioning, orders were still being sent, reports were still arriving, units were still moving. But nothing was fully connected anymore. Each part of the battlefield was operating under its own pressure, its own timing, its own understanding of events. To the west, Wellington remained unchanged, a fixed point of resistance behind the ridge, unmoving, unbroken. At the centre, the French continued to press forward, but every advance now came with delay, with hesitation, with fragmentation. To the east, the Prussians were no longer approaching the battle, they were now part of it, actively shaping its outcome. French units along the flank began to fall back in sequence, not as a single retreat, but as a chain reaction. One position gave way, then another, until the line itself stopped behaving like a line. It became a series of isolated breaks. Napoleon tried to stabilize the army, but stabilization required cohesion, and cohesion was already slipping away. Every order he issued was only partially carried out. Napoleon tried to stabilize the army, but stabilization required cohesion, and cohesion was already slipping away. Every order he issued was only partially carried out. Some units responded correctly, others too late, others not at all. The result was inconsistency across the battlefield, and inconsistency is often more dangerous than failure, because it cannot be predicted, contained, or corrected with certainty. The battlefield was no longer responding evenly to French pressure. It reacted differently from one sector to another. Every unexpected response demanded another adjustment, creating a cycle that fed itself. To the west, still resistance. At the center, still pressure. To the east, an accelerating battle. Napoleon was no longer facing a shortage of strength. He was facing a loss of unity, and once unity is lost, even a powerful army becomes something else, a collection of separate parts, no longer a single force, and battles are won by unified armies, not by scattered parts. The investigation had reached the final stage before structural failure became impossible to ignore, because what still held the French line together was momentum alone, and momentum cannot survive forever under growing contradiction. Control was no longer held in one place. It was dissolving into motion, not collapse, not yet, but separation. The battlefield was still active, but it was no longer unified. Orders continued to arrive, but execution varied. Sometimes immediately, sometimes late, sometimes not at all, and that difference was now becoming decisive. To the west, Wellington remained unchanged, a fixed line of resistance, hidden behind the ridge, absorbing pressure without revealing weakness. At the center, the French attack continued, but no longer as a single wave. It had become scattered pressure. Independent attacks, uncoordinated advances, local attempts to preserve momentum. To the east, the Prussians were no longer entering the battlefield. They were reshaping it. Every contact created displacement. Every displacement forced a withdrawal. Every withdrawal opened new gaps. Napoleon's control still existed, but it was no longer absolute. It depended on delay, on distance, on whether an order still matched reality by the time it arrived. Increasingly, it did not. French headquarters was now forced into constant adjustment, not strategy. Adjustment. Every movement solved one problem and created another. Every adjustment restored balance in one sector while weakening another. The battlefield had entered a state where balance itself had become impossible. Only instability remained. And instability has a direction of its own. French units began acting independently, without formally breaking apart. Not rebellion, not panic, but separation. Each sector responded to its own pressure. Each commander interpreted events locally. And together, those local decisions no longer reflected the commander's original intent. That is how armies begin to fail, without realizing it, not by breaking, but by drifting apart from within. Wellington held. The Prussians advanced, and the French center was no longer truly a center. It was becoming a battlefield of disconnected actions, still fighting, still moving, but no longer together. And in war, that is the moment when the outcome stops being uncertain and begins to feel inevitable. The French center was still fighting, but it was no longer directing the battle. It was reacting, moment by moment, pressure by pressure. To the west, Wellington remained unchanged, a fixed line of resistance behind the ridge, silent, unmoving, still intact. To the east, the Prussians were now fully part of the battlefield, no longer approaching it, shaping it. French positions along the flank began to give way in sequence, not all at once, one position first, then another. Then the gap between them widened faster than it could be closed, and the center felt it, not through reports, but through the loss of cohesion. Napoleon was still issuing orders, but those orders no longer matched the battlefield. By the time they arrived, the battle had already moved on. Every adjustment came too late to restore balance. The French army was no longer acting as a unified force. It had become separate sectors, each under its own pressure, each responding correctly to its own situation, but no longer to the battle as a whole. The French army was no longer acting as a unified force. It had become separate sectors, each under its own pressure, each responding correctly to its own situation, but no longer to the battle as a whole. That is how cohesion dies, not through collapse, but through misalignment. The centre still tried to pressure Wellington, but every attack now came from a different condition, different timing, different strength, different awareness of what was happening elsewhere. The attack lost its single shape. It became scattered actions, still dangerous, still active, but no longer coordinated. To the east, the Prussians continued to advance, step by step. They were no longer influencing the battle from its edge. They were now inside it. Every French adjustment in the centre weakened the flank. Every reinforcement sent to the flank weakened the centre. There was no longer a stable solution, only trade-offs that steadily weakened the army. Napoleon's command remained active, but it was no longer shaping the outcome. It was managing decline. And the battlefield was no longer coming apart in one place. It was unraveling everywhere. What remained was still an army, but no longer a unified one, and in war that is already the beginning of the end. There comes a point in every command when orders are still being given, but coherence is already gone. By now, French headquarters were still functioning, messages were still being written, couriers were still riding, signals were still being sent. But what those messages described no longer matched the battlefield by the time they arrived. To the west, Wellington still held, unmoving behind the ridge, a line of resistance that refused to change. To the east, the Prussians were now fully engaged, no longer approaching, no longer threatening. They were already fighting. French units along the flank were pushed back in uneven waves. To the east, the Prussians were now fully engaged, no longer approaching, no longer threatening. They were already fighting. French units along the flank were pushed back in uneven waves. It had become a chain of local battles, each reacting to the nearest threat, each increasingly disconnected from the others. Napoleon's orders still carried authority, but they arrived too late to restore cohesion. A reinforcement sent east weakened the centre. A renewed attack in the centre exposed the flank. Every correction strengthened one sector while weakening another. The battlefield no longer remained stable for more than a few minutes. Everything shifted, everything adapted, everything deteriorated. French officers began to notice something even more dangerous. The enemy was no longer the only problem. Their own army was losing cohesion. Units no longer acted as parts of one plan. They acted according to immediate necessity. Those necessities were no longer the same. To the west, resistance. At the centre, exhaustion. To the east, the growing weight of a second army. Three realities. One army. No way left to unite them in time. Napoleon was still making decisions, but those decisions could no longer shape the battle. They could only respond to it, and reaction always arrives too late. To restore control, the investigation had reached the point where command no longer determined the outcome, because the outcome was already being shaped elsewhere. Beyond decision, beyond control, beyond time. It does not happen all at once. Nothing important ever does. It begins with hesitation, a delay too small to notice, then another, then a gap between intention and execution. And that gap becomes visible. To the west, Wellington still held, unmoved, unbroken, a fixed line of resistance that refused every attempt to break it. To the east, the Prussians were no longer arriving. They were already fighting. French units along the flank were no longer forming a solid defense. They were fragmenting under constant pressure, step by step, position by position, decision by decision. And at the center, something finally changed. Not a collapse, not a rout, a loss of cohesion. One coordinated assault failed to come together. Then another. Without synchronization, pressure was no longer absorbed evenly. It began to concentrate. French officers tried to restore order. But order requires time, and time was running out. Messages arrived late. Reserves arrived in scattered groups. Counterattacks overlapped with new enemy pressure. Nothing matched anymore. Napoleon was still issuing orders. But the battlefield no longer responded as one army. It responded sector by sector, each under different pressure, each fighting a different battle. To the west, resistance held. To the east, pressure increased. At the center, the line struggled to hold together. 3 forces, 1 army, and now the center was no longer holding. It was bending, not breaking, not yet. But it was no longer stable enough to recover. And in war, once the center loses its shape, everything around it begins to follow. Not immediately, but inevitably, the investigation had reached its final stage. Control no longer shaped the outcome. It could only witness it as it unfolded. The battlefield does not announce its final shift. It simply stops behaving the way it did before. By now, the French center was still there, still active, still fighting. But something essential had changed. It no longer had a clear direction. Wellington's line remained unchanged, a fixed line behind the ridge. Silent, enduring, unmoved by everything thrown against it. To the east, the Prussians were fully engaged. Their presence was no longer pressure. It was contact, constant, expanding, irreversible. French units along the flank were no longer reacting to orders. They were reacting to survival, and survival does not wait. At the center, one last attempt to restore a coordinated attack began. Not a full offensive, just one final effort to regain control. It failed before it had fully formed. Timing no longer matched. Some units advanced, some hesitated, some never moved at all. That was the moment the line began to come apart, not through destruction, but through the loss of cohesion. Napoleon was still issuing orders, but every order reached a different battlefield. The same instruction produced different results depending on where it arrived. French headquarters was beginning to understand. The army was no longer acting as one force. Each part fought its own battle. To the west, resistance held. To the east, the pressure grew. At the center, cohesion continued to fade. The battlefield had reached the point where small adjustments no longer mattered. Only 2 possibilities remained: one final effort, or collapse. Either way, the direction was the same. The investigation had reached its final threshold. The commanders could still shape how the battle ended, but no longer whether it would. The moment of collapse is rarely a single moment. It is a sequence that can no longer be reversed. By now, the French center was no longer holding together. It was only moving, barely. To the west, Wellington still held, anchored behind the ridge, still absorbing every attack, still showing no sign of breaking. The French no longer needed to destroy that line. They only needed to outlast it. And they no longer could. To the east, the Prussians had fully entered the battle. They were no longer arriving. They were already shaping events. French positions along the flank began to give way, one after another. Not randomly, but because pressure arrived faster than the army could respond. That difference in timing was becoming decisive, At the center, one final attempt to launch a coordinated attack began, but it came too late. Different units received the same order at different times. So they fought different versions of the same battle. Some advanced into the smoke, some held their ground, some drifted sideways, searching for formations that no longer existed. That was the moment the center lost its shape, not its courage, not its strength, its cohesion. And without cohesion, strength means very little. French headquarters tried to restore control, but every correction arrived too late. Orders were accurate when they were written, outdated when they arrived. Napoleon was still giving orders, but those orders could no longer unite the battlefield. They expressed intention. They no longer guaranteed results. To the west, resistance held. To the east, the Prussians kept advancing. At the center, the army continued to fragment. The battlefield had reached a new condition. It no longer reacted, one decision at a time. Everything happened at once. No army can survive that for long, not because its soldiers lack courage, but because no army can remain united when every part is fighting a different battle. And now the French army was beginning to come apart, not all at once, but everywhere at the same time. There is always one final attempt before an army realizes it can no longer fight as one. By now, French headquarters still functioned, but only in appearance, not in unity, not in timing, not in purpose. To the west, Wellington still held, behind the ridge, unmoved, unbroken. Every French attack ended the same way. To the east, the Prussians were now fully engaged. No longer an army approaching the battlefield, they had become part of it. French units on the right were losing ground, one position after another, contact after contact, decision after decision. At the center, Napoleon ordered one final coordinated attack, one last effort to regain control. Orders were issued, reserves were committed. The advance began. For a brief moment it almost seemed that cohesion might return, but the moment had already passed. Different corps received the same order under different conditions. Some were under heavy pressure, some were already falling back, others had lost communication altogether. The coordinated attack never truly came together. It broke apart almost as soon as it began. What should have been one assault became many smaller ones. Each fought its own battle. The center did not collapse. It simply failed to act as one. Napoleon was still watching the battlefield, still giving orders, but the army no longer moved together. Each part reacted to its own danger. Between those reactions, there was only distance. To the west, resistance. To the east, the Prussians pressing forward. At the center, the last traces of coordination began to disappear. Even the strongest army cannot fight as one once every part is fighting a different battle. That is where defeat begins. There comes a moment in every battle when nothing new is decided. Only consequences remain. By now, the French army was no longer fighting as one. Some units still advanced, others fell back, many simply fought to survive. To the west, Wellington still held. Behind the ridge, unmoved, unbroken, he had never needed a spectacular victory, he only needed to endure. And he had. To the east, the Prussians were now fully part of the battle, no longer approaching, no longer expected. They were there. Every minute, their pressure increased. Every minute, French options became fewer. Napoleon was still giving orders, but the battlefield no longer moved as one. Messages arrived too late. Units fought different battles. The army that had crossed Europe could no longer move with one purpose. Defeat did not arrive with one charge, or one cannon, or one mistake. It arrived one delay at a time, one missed opportunity, one exhausted regiment, one lost hour. until there was nothing left to hold everything together. That is the strange truth about Waterloo. Empires do not always fall because their enemies are stronger. Sometimes they fall because time, distance, and thousands of ordinary decisions become stronger than any single commander. For more than 200 years, people have asked, who lost Waterloo? Napoleon? Nay? The Rhine? The Prussians? Perhaps that was never the right question, because this battlefield never belonged to one man. It belonged to everyone who stood here, to every soldier who never saw the whole picture, to every officer who acted with incomplete knowledge, to every messenger who arrived too late. History remembers names, but battlefields remember people, not with monuments, not with speeches, but with silence, a silence that still hangs over Waterloo. And perhaps that is the final lesson. No empire is defeated in a single moment. It is defeated long before anyone realizes the battle has already been lost. Case closed. The battle does not end when the shooting stops. It ends when history begins to understand what happened. After Waterloo, the field fell silent. But nothing would ever be the same again. The French army did not disappear in a single moment. It withdrew, it scattered, it survived where it could. The army that had once crossed Europe could no longer move as one. Wellington's army remained standing, not untouched, not unhurt, but together. That made all the difference. To the east, the Prussians had arrived, not as rescuers, not as spectators, but as the final weight that tipped the balance. The battle could no longer turn back. Napoleon had won battles that seemed impossible. He had changed Europe, changed armies, changed history. But even he could not command time itself. Waterloo was not decided by one charge, or one mistake, or one commander. It was decided by hundreds of decisions, some brilliant, some ordinary, all connected. That is why people still return to this battlefield, not to count the dead or measure the ground, but to ask how great victories become great defeats. Perhaps that is the final lesson. History is rarely changed by one dramatic moment. More often, it changes one decision at a time. One delay, one mistake, one missed opportunity. Today, the fields of Waterloo are quiet once again. The grass has returned, the smoke is gone, the cannon have fallen silent. Only the memory remains. The battlefield remembers even when the world has forgotten. Case file closed.